In this lesson, what we're going to do is start talking about the next of our substantive topics for GCSE Religious Studies. What we're going to do is focus on this idea of relationships and families within the context of Christianity. Now, normally this wouldn't actually chronologically end up at this point in the GCSE, because you would first do and you would first study things like Islamic practices and Islamic theology. And the point that I'm doing here is that I'm going to try and group all of the Christianity topics together and do all them first and then focus on Islam at the end. And so therefore we'll talk about relationships and families over the next few lessons, and then we'll also do the existence of God and a couple of other relationships between other kind of Christian issues as well. And then we move on to looking at Islamic theology and Islamic practices. So this is going to be focusing on the role and the purpose of families and relationships within the Christian context. So we're doing it through the lens of Christian doctrine, as you can imagine, and the relationships and families modules focuses specifically on Christianity. And what is interesting is it also focuses on issues that we've already explored in previous lessons. So we've already been talking about things relating to Christian doctrines, related to things like marriage and to things like relationships as well, but we haven't gone into them in any kind of detail, but we're going to go into them in a lot more detail in this series of lessons. That's essentially what we're going to be focusing on. So the concept of the family is one of the most fundamental elements of Christian doctrine, because what it does is it provides a detailed examination of the normative realities of the lives of Christians, because what is essentially being prescribed here is how people ought to live and how people ought to live their lives, and this is done so through this lens of Christian and family relationships. Christianity teaches us that God provides family and family structure to allow people to develop and grow into close relationships with other individuals. Now, this is done through things like the sacrament of marriage, if you're looking at it through the lens of Catholicism, or just through marriage in general, if you're looking at other Christian denominations. And the family unit has what exists as a father, a mother, and children. And children are required to honour their parents, and parents are required to respect their children. This is supported with biblical evidence, which we'll get to at the end of this lesson. So let's focus on the concept of families within a specific Christian denomination, that being the Church of England. The Church of England recommends to its diocese that they should encourage its local parishes to run courses on something known as the preparation for marriage. So when you go through the process of marriage, it can, for some people, be a very big step, a very big process in one's life, which is one of the reasons why within Catholic doctrine it is seen as a sacrament. And so therefore, the Diocese of the Church of England argue that there ought to be courses ran on how to prepare individuals when they go through the process of marriage. And what this is done is in line with the view that marriage preparation can help individuals to develop deeper and strong connections in family life. And so when there are struggles when it comes to family relationships and family life, their preparation beforehand will give them the kind of tools and insight into being able to overcome these challenges, essentially, which is something that is very important. Within the Church of England, as well as within other denominations, there is the encouragement of Christian practices done onto children. So one example of this is, of course, infant baptism, which is seen as another sacrament in a number of different denominations. And for the most part, baptism is something that is recommended to be done onto children. In fact, in the earlier period of European history, so for example within medieval European history and into the sort of early modern period, infants would be baptized almost as soon as they're born, because there is this belief that you have to rid the child of original sin, which is a very much an Augustinian practice, and from some of the early church fathers and church doctrines that came out after the development of Christianity. And so the idea being that children ought to be born and baptized almost immediately, straight away. Now, of course, it's not as strict in the modern context, so people tend to be baptized a few years after they're born, or in and around a year or so after they're born. But there are obviously some denominations that we looked at when we looked at Christian practices that believes that baptism ought to be something that is done with the consent of the person to be baptized. So that has to be something that is done voluntarily. And so it has to be, you have to wait until adulthood in order to be baptized, which sort of is a little bit more in line with the idea that we actually see when we talk about baptism in the Bible itself, when Jesus baptized and was baptized by a number of individuals within the Christian stories. Within the Catholic Church, we have a concept known as Catism, which tells us, and it tells Christians, that the role and purpose of the family is central to the importance of society. Now, according to this doctrine of the Catholic Church, family is the original cell of social life. So they really do place a very front and center emphasis on the concept of strong familial relationships. And essentially, the discussion of the values that ought to be upheld within a good and proper Christian society are that which put front and center the concept of strong familial relationships. One final element of the general ideas relating to families and relationships is this concept of fidelity. Now, we are going to focus on all of these different things in more detail as we go through this series. So the next lesson is going to talk about marriage. The lesson after that is going to focus on other kinds of sexual relationships that people can engage with, and how the church and how Christianity deals with some of those particular issues. But one of these issues is that of fidelity. Fidelity is the idea that when in marriage, one ought to be faithful to their significant other. And this is in line with the Christian concept that the adultery is a sin within Christian doctrine. So it's sort of the flip side of the coin to this idea of adultery being a sin in Christianity. If that is the case, then therefore, when one is in marriage, one ought to be faithful to their significant other. And I'm just going to finish by providing a couple of different examples of quotations from biblical evidence that you can use as just general reference to the importance of family and the emphasis that is placed on the concept of family. So we have, for example, this passage here from Ephesians 5:25 that tells us that husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up to her. We have one here from John saying that we love because he first loved us. So we're seeing a symbolic connection between the love that God presents onto people and the love that we as people present onto others within a familial setting. In Exodus, we say, honor thy father and thy mother so that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you. So again, this is quite a famous passage from Exodus, an early Old Testament passage. And then finally, one of the earliest of the passages, the oldest of the passages, is that of Genesis from 26 to 28, saying that one must be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Again, focusing on this idea of familial relationships and one loving each other within a kind of family and within a relationship context.